Well, good morning, everybody. Certainly a pleasure to have you with us. We appreciate the time you're taking out from your busy schedules to get an update on what Energistics will be doing in this year 2019. So let's get started with the presentation, which is coming up right now. So here we are. So a pleasure to have you today. As you know, in such a webinar, we have quite a wide demographic joining us. So some of you hopefully are already familiar with Zoom, and those of you who are learning will find it relatively easy to walk around. We are not allowing chat and raised hands in this particular event due to the wide audience, but there is a question and answer feature that's available throughout the session. Please feel free to ask questions. We cannot commit to answering everything, but we will certainly address whatever issues are raised later on, if not during the actual conference. First of all, we would like to know who's attending the event. It helps us pitch it and also organize other events on a basis of the interest of this audience. Pardon me, one too many. So the poll that's going to come up will be asking questions about the region in which you reside. So a single choice in that case. The second one will be some interest in whether you've worked or not with Energistics in the past 5 years. Check all that apply in that case. And finally, a question about the use within your company of the Energistics standards. And again, check all that apply. So this shouldn't take more than 30 seconds, a minute for you to fill out. We'd really appreciate you doing that. Yeah, I see there's an enthusiastic update on the control panel.
Yeah, so I went ahead and launched while you were talking to give folks a little bit more time, Phil.
Thanks, Jenna.
And welcome, everybody. Good to see you.
We particularly appreciate the people joining from Asia Pacific. We know it's late in the night for you. Thanks for your effort.
Yeah, so we know we're going to have a mix of people who are very familiar with us and others who are less so. So this gives us an opportunity to hopefully send all of you away with something of value. As we move forward, and give it another second. I'll go ahead and end the polling now. And okay, so not unexpectedly, majority are joining us from North America. And as Phil said, thank you very much for joining us from Western Europe and Asia Pacific. 48% of you are members, so that's good to know, or at least your companies anyway. And looks like we have a fair number who are very familiar with us, and maybe some who are a little less so. Lots of WhatsMLS use. We hope to see the numbers of ProdML, RescueML, and ETP and other standards go up as we move forward through the year. So welcome and thank you. Back to you, Phil.
Y saludos también a la gente de México que se están a nosotros. Gracias. Okay, so first of all, a few words about the people hosting this event. For those of you who are not familiar with us, I am Philip Neri. I oversee the consortium's marketing and communication efforts, activities to drive mainly adoption and uptake, and drive awareness of our standards towards companies that are not yet members of our community and who should really consider joining. Jana is responsible for the strategic planning, to define operational and adoption goals, as well as delivery, managing execution of deliverables through appropriate staff and members, engagement with external standard organizations, and working with the CEO to ensure the continued financial viability of Energistics, both in terms of operations and the special interest groups. Jay Hollingsworth is responsible for technical oversight and quality of the standards stewarded by the organization. This is, of course, inclusive of WhatsMLS, ProdML, RescueML, and the Energistics Transfer Protocol, known as ETP, among others. Under Jay's distinguished leadership, Energistics has realized the goal of an integrated family of standards based on a common technical architecture. In addition to providing technical oversight, Jay is the main trainer for Energistics and represents our organization on various technical committees of other association and standards bodies. Now, the agenda today is going to consist of the oversight of overview of Energistics, an overview of the current standards, our plans for 2019, how we work, and then the Q&A session. So about Energistics. It is important to emphasize, for those who are not familiar with us, that we are not a vendor. We don't actually sell anything. We are a non-profit industry organization. Our role is to help companies manage and share data more efficiently and more cost-effectively by using industry-defined data exchange standards. And we've been around a long time. We've been around actually for more than 25 years. 28 or 9 is actually the accurate count. We count 110 members, including leading E&P companies, R-field service companies, software vendors, system integrators, regulatory agencies, and more recently also cloud providers. Our standards are the result of open collaboration between members facilitated by Energistics. So really the heavy lifting is done by our members, people from our member organizations. In short, the standards are created by the industry and for the industry. This is an overview of membership, and we didn't even manage to squeeze everyone into this picture, but it gives you an idea of the diversity, both in terms of the nature of the company, the size of the companies, their geographical locations. We really can claim to be a global organization, and we thank every one of them for both their technical and financial contributions to this initiative. And so without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Jay Hollingsworth, the microphone, so that he can give you an overview of the actual standards that we manage.
Thanks, Phil. Good morning, everybody. Can you hear me okay, Phil?
I can hear you very well.
Good. So I guess we just go on to the next slide. I'm going to give an overview. I'm Jay Hollingsworth, as Phil said. I'm going to give an overview of the standards that Energistics stewards on behalf of our membership. So many of you will be familiar with some of these, and we have standards basically that cover the breadth of the technical information that's transferred in the oil and gas industry, excepting seismic, of course. So we have a standard called WhatsML, which is anything to do with a well, but in particular, the drilling of the well. WhatsML, I guess, is the most famous one, and it's real-time and static information about a well, including its construction. We have another standard called ProdML, which is anything to do with surface measurements, production, testing, that kind of stuff. And finally, we have a third standard, which is called RescueML, which is about Earth model components and anything to do with geoscience, interpretation, reservoir engineering, that part of the oil and gas industry. So these standards have been around for a while. WhatsML is nearly 20 years old, and they were developed rather independently by a collaboration among the subject matter experts in those particular domains. And those individual standards sometimes actually were an outside group. So the WhatsML group originally was a separate standalone group. So as they grew up over a period of years, they grew somewhat apart. But if you could click the slide, Phil, and just advance through the animation. Over the last few years, we've worked to, in fact, merge these standards together so that they comprise a coherent whole and eliminate the barriers between them. Because people don't want to have to think about using one standard to move one kind of data and a different standard to move a different kind of data. So regardless of the type of data, they can all be jumbled together in a single data transfer. And we do this by we've done this by putting them on a common technical architecture. That's not really magic. That just means basically that they share the same units of measure, the same reference data, coordinate reference systems, they have a common style. Now it effectively looks like one big standard, but we still have the 3 individual teams of subject matter experts, the special interest groups, who are the ones who actually drive the content of the standards themselves. And then Phil mentioned we have something called the Energistics Transfer Protocol. So I'm going to talk about each of these things in turn. So why don't we move ahead and we'll talk specifically about WhatsML for a couple of minutes. So WhatsML, as I said before, has anything to do with the well and the well bore. And the thing it's most famous for is the real-time data transfer that's mentioned on the slide here. And in the world of WhatsML, we kind of recognize that in the drilling world, there's 3 sorts of data. One sort of data are objects that really don't change very often. That would be the familiar well and well header, well bore header kind of information. You know, who's the operator, what's the percentage ownership of the operator, what's the surface location of the well, that sort of stuff. It doesn't really change as you drill ahead. And WhatsML is used in some companies actually as a data standard to move well header data between applications or between a master repository, a well master repository and applications. So that's a reference object. Then there's a third kind of object, I've skipped the second one. There's a third kind of object, which are snapshots in time. And those are things like a drilling morning report or an operations report that you would get from the vessel, which is a semi-submersible or a ship-shaped drilling rig. Fluid analyses, those kinds of things are a statement of something at a point in time. And so we call those reports. But the thing that people focus on with WhatsML the most are the growing objects. So these are the real-time data as you're drilling ahead. That includes the trajectory, because as you drill ahead, you're adding length to the well bore, so you add new directional survey stations, which adds to the trajectory. And then logs, and logs in our world doesn't mean just a wireline log. It's also a continuous log of the readings on the drilling rig itself. So as you continue in a drilling operation, you always have a hook load or a rate of penetration or something like that. And those real-time drilling channels also are handled as logs in the WhatsML world. So those objects that grow over time, those reference objects and those snapshot in time are the kinds of data that move via WhatsML, which basically covers everything in a drilling operation plus reference data about the well bore. And the use cases for these data are kind of 3, the common use cases. One, as I mentioned before, is you can move well-related data among applications, and that could be between 2 running applications or between a database and an application. That could be between an operator company's application and an application at a regulator. There are some places that use WhatsML as a regulatory reporting vehicle for reporting drilling data between an operator and a regulator. So that's a pretty common use case. The second use case that's really well known for WhatsML is real-time, the real-time data. So the real-time operation centers that operators typically have where they're monitoring critical wells in real time, that data typically moves from the field into the office or from the field into the cloud and then visualized in the office. All of that real-time streaming data typically is done via WhatsML. So there are many of the operators and the service companies that Phil showed on his slide earlier that have implemented WhatsML for doing that real-time data transfer. And the third use case, which is kind of an upcoming use case, if you will, and in fact, this use case applies to all 3 of the standards that we're going to talk about, is an archival use case. So if somebody wants to give you a file or set of files that contain all of the data about the drilling of a well, it's difficult to imagine what file format you would put that in. You couldn't put it in an Excel spreadsheet, you know. And the truth is, people have realized now that the WhatsML transfer format is a good way, in fact, to deliver an archive of something which is not in real time. Kind of, you know, the same way that you would use a seg-y tape, you know, to move seismic data. You could have a set of WhatsML files that represent the entire construction history of a well and its wellbores. So those are the three typical use cases, and that archival use cases I said will appear on all of the three standards. So Phil, you want to move ahead to the next one? Thanks. So we have a second standard, which is called ProdML. ProdML, the prod part, is for production, and it has some similar use cases, but its use cases differ in certain ways. So ProdML is used to move anything to do with production or surface data. But production data inherently is pretty heterogeneous. And in fact, the people who work with production-related data in operators tend to be specialists, and one specialist may not communicate very well with another specialist, but the ProdML standard caters to the whole breadth of all of the people that are working in production. So with ProdML, you could be moving real-time measurements. Real-time measurements could be a well test. It could be some downhole distributed acoustic sensing, fiber sensing, you know, kind of measurements. It could be just simple real-time production volumes from flow meters, pressure, temperature, that kind of information. So it's intended to be able to move all of this kind of data in real time. But WhatsML can also be used for describing the actual static connections of the equipment that's on the surface. So if you have a big flow network and you want to have a vendor neutral way to describe which pipes are connecting which pumps to which tanks, to which manifolds, to which chokes, and all of the surface equipment that you find in a production operation, ProdML has a standard way to describe the interconnectivity of that equipment. And then separately, ProdML can also report the hydraulic network because a lot of those valves will be closed. And so you want to report where is the hydrocarbon or water flowing in the pipes, as opposed to what pipes are connected to which pieces of equipment, and ProdML is able to handle all of that kind of information. ProdML is used as WhatsML is for regulatory reporting. So there are places where nearly everywhere an operator will report the monthly production from their wells, and sometimes it's reported more often. ProdML offers a vendor neutral way to be able to do that. Regulators sort of like this because it's something that they don't have to have their own standard and maintain it for a reporting interface. The operators sort of like it because if once I get this developed once, then in theory, I'll be able to use that to multiple regulatory authorities and not have to maintain bespoke software for each individual regulator. So the idea of using a vendor neutral standard for regulatory reporting is kind of attractive to all sides of that. And of course, people who use ProdML to report production volumes back and forth to their partners. You know, you're going to have non-operative partners in a well, and you need some way to give them periodic production reports, if that's daily or weekly or monthly, and ProdML is useful for that as well. The other big use of ProdML in the data transfer sense is in analyses. So, for example, somebody may do a PVT analysis or crude assay, and there are all these proprietary ways to be able to report the compositional analysis of your hydrocarbons from that measurement company to the operator customer. And ProdML offers a vendor neutral way to be able to do that. So really, pretty much any of the data types that you find in production are covered in the ProdML standard. So that data transfer is one. The second is a similar use case, as I said before, that applications can use ProdML to move data back and forth between applications. And then finally, if you wanted to have a vendor neutral way to archive some production related data where you're not tying that data to a particular user application, then ProdML is a great way to store that data in an archive. And when we say an archive, it could actually be a static archive, or it could be something like a data lake. If you're going to try to pick a format that you're going to store data in a vendor neutral way, so you can have it available for big data analytics, ProdML is a really great format for that, and we're seeing a lot of operators that are starting to do this. The data scientists, typically in a data lake, data is loaded into a data lake in its native format, and then it's up to the data scientist people to be able to interpret all of those different data formats at the time they do the analysis. Well, if that data is presented in a vendor neutral industry standard way, it makes the job of getting that information into an analytical application just that much easier because it's in a common format. So when I say archival, that use case isn't only for a static archive to have things locked away, it's also that data lake kind of use case. So that's ProdML, Phil. And the third standard, the third of the 3 ML standards, is called RescueML. RescueML is really all about moving data in the Earth model chain. RescueML doesn't attempt to move raw seismic data. That's the province of the SEG standards SEG-D and SEG-Y. But once information reaches the seismic interpretation application, then RescueML takes over as the standard that can be used to move data across the whole geoscience workflow. And we have an example here on the screen that you could use RescueML to actually move your velocity model back and forth between the seismic processing if you're doing pre-stack depth migration. But once you reach seismic interpretation, then you're going to make a structural model. After you have a structural model, you're going to build layer cake or other kind of a velocity model, so the velocity models can move via RescueML. Then once we reach the point of geologic interpretation, we're switching from depth to time. We may be building grids by this time, or voxels of some kind, to do that geologic interpretation, or you may be interpreting on the time scale created from the seismic data. And then as you progress your geologic model, eventually you're going to begin to characterize the reservoir, distribute properties around on some kind of a grid. That grid is normally too fine to be able to present to a reservoir simulator. So eventually you do what's called upscaling, which is really downscaling in a sense. You make a coarser grid, which can be computed in a reasonable time in a reservoir simulator. Then it goes to reservoir simulation, although on this little slide we have a special kind of reservoir simulation called streamline analysis. RescueML explicitly covers streamline analysis, but it also obviously covers regular reservoir simulation. And then of course, after the reservoir simulator, you're going to plan the development of that reservoir. So you're going to place your wells, the completed intervals, and the well paths. So moving that information back and forth to the drilling planning application. And so that's the sort of loop that's shown on this particular slide, but there's a lot of other things that we do in the geoscience and reservoir engineering world, and RescueML's ambition is, in fact, to cover all of that information as it moves between any 2 vendor applications. So as an example of that, this past year, a bunch of our members, our software vendor members, worked together with BP and Shell on a pilot to prove the usefulness of RescueML in doing partner data transfer. So that would be BP and Shell are partners on a project which is operated by BP, and BP shares Earth model information with Shell. They don't use the same products, vendor products to do geoscience and reservoir simulation. So they set out to show that RescueML was a good way to be able to move that data back and forth. And the pilot was a success, and Jan will talk about future plans for 2019. It's going to carry on, but we did show the use of a live demonstration among these vendors using BP and Shell's data at SEG in Anaheim in 2019. So Phil, I guess if you want to move to the next one. We have a little, the field that was used incidentally is a small field called the Kepler field, which is in the Naquique complex in the Mississippi Canyon area of the Gulf of Mexico. Just a picture of where it is relative to New Orleans, and a statement that the these are the data types that we moved in this live running demo at SEG. So we had wells with trajectories and logs. There were faults horizons, polygons. We moved static 3D arrays with grids with properties in those grids, and then after the reservoir simulator was done, we used RescueML to move the time-stepped 3D grids with their properties for visualization. So if you jump on ahead, Phil, you can see that here are the products that we used were RMS from Roxar, SCUA Paradigm SCUA, OpenFlow from Institut Français de Pétrole, that fed into Petrel back into SCUA, integrate the results back into SCUA, and then the resulting grids were pushed into IMEX from Computer Modeling Group, and then the time-stepped results were visualized in DJI's COVIS 4D. So all of these companies collaborated with us and gave a demo. A really interesting thing about the demo was the fact that it was all done in the cloud. Rather than have 6 or 7 people standing around with their laptops up at the front of a room, Amazon offered to let us install all of the software in the cloud, which we did. Amazon Web Services, of course, is a member of Energistics. And so they provided an environment for that. But Schlumberger uses something they call Delphi, which everyone knows is actually the Google Cloud. So as part of this pilot, we also demonstrated live moving data from the Amazon cloud across that boundary into the Google Cloud, importing the data into Petrel, making changes in the data in Petrel, and then pushing it back to the Amazon cloud from the Delphi environment so that SCUA from Paradigm could pick it up. And of course, Paradigm and Roxar, if you click one more time, Phil, Paradigm and Roxar are no longer standalone companies. They're now both part of Emerson. So that demonstration was well attended and was a good success, and we expect to be repeating it. Jana will mention that when she talks about the plans for what we're going to do the rest of this year. Finally, a fourth thing that we do, in addition to focusing on those ML standards, is something that called the Energistics Transfer Protocol. So historically, the standards that Energistics produced have been XML, and those XML schemas were tied to SOAP, Simple Object Access Protocol, which is the original web services way of interacting with computers. And that's the way it's been for quite a while. But over the last few years, the community has moved beyond those web services into a more advanced, true streaming way to interact not only with real-time data, but also the way that a client application interacts with a store to retrieve data. So this new way of working is called the Energistics Transfer Protocol. For real-time streaming data, it's orders of magnitude faster to stream via WebSocket, which is a companion standard to HTML5. These are the protocols that run the internet. And now we actually truly stream data as opposed to making repeated calls via web services to find out if there's any new data on a platform or from a WhatsML database. Truly real-time, much lower latency, much more data filling up the bandwidth. There's a great example on the website that we've given from previous webinars. Statoil implemented this with its partners, Baker Hughes and Kongsberg, who are both Energistics members, on the Troll field, and the kind of response they got from the operational people is that this was going to enable the drilling operations to have fewer people offshore, because now they have a practically zero latency view of the real-time data as it's happening during the drilling operation. And that was especially true, according to what Statoil said in the webinar, not so much for Statoil people, but for service company people. There's a lot of service companies that are present on a drilling operation, and they all want to have multiple people offshore, which puts them at risk, because offshore is effectively, essentially a risky business. It meant you have to allocate beds for them on distant offshore platforms like Troll. So now Statoil is able to conduct its field operations with fewer service company personnel needing to be present on the platform, which saves everybody money and lowers everyone's risk. So it's a real benefit. But ETP isn't limited to that particular use case. So ETP has now been picked up by some of our different vendors that don't really work with drilling, to move to stream data between RescueML data between earth modeling applications, or the people who work with distributed acoustic sensing data in the field are looking at streaming that sort of very dense measurement data in real time from the field back to the office. And every time anybody looks at ETP, they can think of some use to be able to truly stream data between two processes. So that's proving to be a very well accepted and something that people are truly excited about, that's coming from the Energistics community. So those are the 4 things I wanted to talk about: WhatsML, ProdML, RescueML, and ETP. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Jana, who will explain what we're going to be working on these things over the rest of the year.
Okay, thanks, Jay. And welcome again, everyone. It's nice to see lots of new names, but also quite a few long time and some newer friends. So welcome especially to folks like Clinton and Harvey and Henri, Jonathan, Joe, Yort, Carl, Luis, who else do we, Peter F and Peter V, Philippe, Palm, Sunil, Raphael, Volker. Very nice to see everybody. And I mentioned some of our folks that have been with us for a long time on the call, because that's really what we are as a community of people. So without further ado, let's go on to 2019 plans. This is really our first chance to kind of publicly debut some work that we did last year with our board of directors and our SIG leadership teams. We thought that it was probably about time to take another look at our vision and mission, something I know everybody just loves to do. May dread it in the moment, but to me, it's always a good idea to do a sanity check on what you're doing and where you're going. And we did do some slight modifications. With respect to our vision, we really are striving for seamless data sharing in oil and gas, and that's a lofty goal, but we certainly hope we're playing our part to get us there, especially in light of digital transformation that I know everybody has as their strategic plan and operationally being implemented as we speak. And from a mission perspective, we really looked at that from a community perspective. There's Energistics, the organization, and then there's Energistics, the community. And we are approaching what we're doing from a community perspective in terms of being able to foster the development and adoption of open data standards in oil and gas. And to this point, we've been primarily in the upstream environment, but the fact is that we're now learning from some of our members that they are looking at how they can leverage our standards in the midstream and downstream arenas. And we're hoping over the course of the year that we may be able to highlight what some of you are doing in the form of either case studies or white papers or success stories. We'll see how that goes. And our tagline is Adopt, Advance, Accelerate. So everything we're doing should in some way refer either to adoption of the standards, advancing them, and in particular accelerating not the standards, but your businesses and how our standards can relate to that. So we also looked at strategic objectives, and at a high level there, as you see here, we first and foremost want to demonstrate the value of the standards to the industry, highlight how they are contributing to digital transformation efforts, for example. As important, perhaps more important, or maybe the most important thing that we do is making our standards easy to implement and use. And by that, we have a number of tools either that have been Energistics developed or more likely were developed by member companies and then either contributed into the Energistics portfolio or are being maintained alongside Energistics, but being retained in the portfolio of whomever the company is that donated it. And one, well, there's actually a couple of examples that I'd like to highlight. One is the ETP Dev Kit that was developed by PDS, and they contributed into the Energistics portfolio, but they still have quite a large role in helping us make sure that it's up to date as development progresses. And then FESAP, which is contributed by F2I Consulting. They reside in France and are led by Philippe Bernet, who is also a consistent contributor originally to RescueML, now to many of our SIGs actually, as well as his client, which is Total, also a member. So those are just two examples of some of the tools that are either there or that we may eventually want to develop in connection with our, or in collaboration with our members. And I know there's a couple of questions that refer to things that we either have and may need to update or maybe don't have. So we can talk about those when we get to Q&A. We want to make, excuse me, we want to make sure that our standards evolve to remain as relevant as possible. And this is particularly in respect to technical environments as they change. So new technologies that are starting to become more relevant. You know, there's been a question about JSON, which we can talk about during Q&A as one example, but also the rise of the cloud. For example, you know, 10 years ago, 25 years ago when we started, the cloud either wasn't dreamed of or it was relatively new, and now everybody's in the cloud. And so how do we make sure that our standards evolve to be able to work as efficiently and effectively as possible in these new environments, as an example. And then from an organization perspective, the first three we really would do very much in collaboration with the overall Energistics community. From an organizational perspective, we also want to make sure that we can sustain our own growth and longevity for the benefit of the industry as well. So we're looking beyond membership, which is really our sole source of support at this point in revenue. We have a few peripheral things, but really seeing how we can expand the organization or maybe do some different things to decrease our reliance strictly on membership dues, because we want to make sure we're here for another 25 or 30 years. Phil's right, we're coming up on our 30th anniversary in 2020, I think. So stay tuned for that. Next. All right, so as Jay mentioned, we have a lot going on this year, both from a development and adoption perspective. WhatsML version 2 is being updated to expand our capabilities and also address bugs found during commercial implementations, which we got a bird's eye view into last year when one of our key member operator companies shared their lessons learned implementing WhatsML v2 with ETP alongside several of their vendors who are also members. And so we are taking that opportunity to look at our overall process, but also to make sure that to the extent we can, those issues that have been found are addressed in the next version of WhatsML, which we expect to come out this year. We also had a lot of work done last year led by Total in in conjunction with other members as well as ISC WSA to update the tool error model. And so there's a number of things going on with WhatsML from a development perspective that will culminate in an updated WhatsML 2 as well as updates to ETP with respect to the WhatsML use cases. And ETP is also, as Jay mentioned, being expanded to have coverage not just for the drilling world, which is kind of where it started, but also reservoir and potentially some production workflows as well. And RescueML, they are really operating on two fronts. They are, first of all, going to continue with the pilot begun last year, led by BP and Shell, to continue implementing and really validating for the industry that the RescueML standard as it is operational and adding value to their operations. But also, we are looking forward to the next version of RescueML, which we tentatively have scheduled to come out next year, depending on how development progresses, as well as what else companies may want to include with the next version. And I should pause here just to say that our development is very much reliant upon real-world use cases and business need. We are not an academic organization. We are led by our members developing what you need to foster your operations back in your own companies. And so with that in mind, the new capabilities and updated or refined capabilities are being directly impacted by what you need in your companies. But the pace at which we work is also being directed by you and your companies, because we are very much a member-oriented organization. So we rely not just on our own staff, which is small but mighty, but also on the resources that our members bring to, and the industry brings to Energistics, so that we can continue and foster this work. So we pretty much have the scope decided for the next version of RescueML, but there's a fair amount of testing and perhaps some new development, new business workflows to be reviewed to make sure that the standard can support them, and if not, what development might be necessary to do that. And then with respect to ProdML, the next version of ProdML, that's actually out for public review. I think we're going to extend it beyond what we currently say, which is the end of February, because we want to allow more time for testing some new capabilities like pressure transient analysis. And also, we've improved the distributed acoustic sensing capabilities to include calibration data. So there's a lot of work that's been done to put the candidate release out, but we do want to have more testing done on those and some other capabilities as well. And then defining and documenting how the standards support these implementations in the cloud environments. They're being used in the cloud today, WhatsML in particular, RescueML now as a result of this pilot. But to the extent that there may be some specific guidance that we can offer, or that the community can offer from their lessons learned of working in a cloud environment, we certainly want to do that as well. And we want to make sure that to the extent that the technology companies, the cloud providers themselves, that they also incorporate our standards in their technology stacks where appropriate. So we have a number of members, AWS is one. There are others who we are working closely with on a number of fronts, and we're very happy that they've joined us, because we really think that that's what's integral, one of the things that's absolutely critical for us to foster adoption and implementation of the standards going forward. On the adoption front, we have a number of initiatives going on. This webinar is an example of one. We want to actually present a series of webinars throughout the course of the year, where we do at least one a month to highlight our standards and how they're being used. So this month is really just laying the groundwork for that. We provide a forum for implementers to share their successes and lessons learned. The best example of that is our SIG meetings, our special interest groups, particularly when they come together 2 or 3 times a year in person, sometimes also in webinar or meeting format, where they can really say, here's what's going on with our implementations, and we can work those issues, but also share their successes as well. I'd like to see that expand beyond the SIG forum, the SIG meeting forum, perhaps to do some meetups or town halls, so to speak, whether they're virtual or in person, not just to talk about our standards, but also to talk about other areas that are of particular interest to the industry, and in some cases where our standards can play a role, but also just to foster thought leadership in the industry as well. Of course, we will continue the BP Shell RescueML implementation pilot. Turned out that we decided that what we did last year was really phase 1 because it elaborated a number of the use cases we had just said that we wanted to include in the pilot, but we didn't get to all of them, so now we're doing a phase 2. Among the things we have planned for this year is, first of all, a webinar of the demo that was done last year at SEG 2018, which was the phase 1 of the pilot. We'd like to have a webinar around that, but then we are also working on phase 2 of the pilot, which is a different workflow, and if all goes well with that, we hope to have another demo at SEG in 2018, and we may do a repeat of the phase 1 demo at EAGE in June. So a lot going on there. I talked a little bit about the fact that we have a number of tools to aid development and deployment of the standards. I mentioned a couple of them, ETP and FASAPI. We hope to have more as the year goes on, and also to make sure that the ones we currently have are up to date and available for use, and that we are able to provide clear guidance around that use. Of course, conferences and user forum papers and participation, anything we can do to get the word out about the standards, and we particularly like it if it's our members getting the word out and we're supporting you. Improving in our documentation, adding to it, we now have Energistics Online, where you can go to for an online version of all of our version 2 documentation, our ML version 2 documentation. So that was launched last year, and we're going to be improving that as this year progresses. We're always looking for case studies and white papers, and we've also been providing both public and private training courses around WhatsML, ProtoML, RescueML, and ETP. We do the public training courses 2 or 3 times a year, definitely for WhatsML. We'd also like to add to that for ProtoML and RescueML. The ETP is incorporated into those training sessions because it's part of our common technical architecture. And sometimes companies engage us privately to work with them because they want to really focus in on their own enterprise environments and really tailor the training to their needs and to their people's needs. So those are just some of the things we have planned for this year. Okay, so how we work, I'll go through that really quickly to allow time for Q&A. Those of you who have been with us for a long time know this is our overall standards development process. I say beyond because for many years we were very focused on development. In the last several years we've been focusing more and more on adoption and how we can support the various adoption and implementation phase of the standards life cycle. So again, a number of tools and documentation, other things that we can provide to the industry to help foster adoption and implementation. So we're doing a lot of work around that. Next. Just briefly, our organization, we have a board that oversees our strategic and financial oversight, special interest groups who are responsible for all the domain-specific work, and then we have more and more cross-SIG, either teams or collaborations between our MLs to make sure that we are moving in lockstep as opposed to in different directions for the various domains, which is kind of how we grew up, but now we want to make sure that we're being cohesive So a couple of examples where we have cross domain and cross SIG expertise collaborating together are around ETP and the cloud. So you can see on the next slide our executive teams for this year. They're elected annually, and we have a broad cross section of our members who contribute to the daily running, actually, of our SIGs and the work that we're doing, who decide the pace at which we're putting releases out, the scope in collaboration with the larger SIGs, and so on. So a special thank you to them and recognition of the various people who are serving on our executive teams. So I would say at this point, we want to open it up for Q&A, but join us. You can see our board of directors looking all spiffy during our November, and I put 2019. I obviously have 2019 on in the brain because these were all 2018. So definitely need to update that. But again, our WhatsMLS SIG actually met 3 times last year. I just put a couple pictures here so you can see. Our WhatsMLS SIG met twice. I put one of the pictures, but just to say, you know, we get together, we do work, and then we have fun, and we hope that you will either stay involved or get involved as the year progresses. Okay, so Phil, can I turn it over to you?
You certainly can, as someone to pick up the questions we have here. We have a question from Manuel Ajito, I hope I pronounced that correctly, saying he's new to WhatsML. A customer of his wants to develop an application that communicates to a WhatsML store, and he had heard a recommendation to use 1.4.1.1 and advised not to use ETP, and asking where he can get the available dev kit, whether it's on Bitbucket or using Nugget packages. Jay, could you pick that one up, please?
Yeah, I have to. It depends on exactly what you're wanting to do. This maybe you should just drop me an email. Depends on exactly what you want to do as to which of our developers kits to use. We have a lot of open source code that's been contributed by our members, and we're working to create proper open source communities that people can make pull requests and so forth. But we do have the WhatsML. Really, it's a standards dev kit that creates proxy classes in .NET for RescueML, ProdML, and WhatsML for the old WhatsML 1.4. For WhatsML 2, the newer stuff, there's a lot more choices. There are more sources to find .NET code, but it's basically the standards dev kit. The NuGet package that for the standards dev kit is a little bit out of date. So you should be pulling the one that's in Bitbucket. If you just drop me an email, I'll tell you exactly what to do.
And just for those who are not familiar with us, you can either use our individual emails, or if you're not sure of how to spell our names, info@energistics.org will be picked up and answered in all circumstances. The next question comes from a very prolific attendee event, Mr. Henri Blondel of Agile Data Decisions in France and Houston. His first question: do you provide a tool to convert a DLIS or LAS into WhatsML?
So the answer is no, as no one has contributed to us a utility to do that. There was such a thing out on the web. We got some notification, I forget who wrote it, but they never kind of contributed the code to us, and we made it available in our own Git environment on Bitbucket. So we don't provide tools. We do host tools that are created by our members for various things, but Henri, you may actually remember where that was. Someone wrote something that was on the web. I can't remember who it was, but anyway, such a thing did exist somewhere out on the web, but we don't provide it.
Okay, another question from Mr. Henri Blondel. I have seen some people promoting JSON as a new standard for well and log data. What is your opinion about this format? Could it replace XML in the future to handle exchange well data?
So JSON will surely replace XML as the basis for data exchanges. The technological holdup for JSON replacing XML has to do with what we would call a JSON schema. So in the world of using XML to transfer data, XML is older and JSON is of course new and more popular. JSON is smaller. JSON file is smaller than an XML file, but in a case, as an architect, in a case where a single developer controls both the reader and the writer of an application, JSON is perfectly fine. In a case where a data transfer is going to be made between two competing companies, or maybe a company and a government agency, then the person who develops the reading application needs to be able to make sure that the data that's contained in that JSON document is exactly as expected. That the attribute names are spelled correctly and the data types are correct and so forth. And that description of a schema, that stuff is handled in XML by a thing called an XML schema. And there's been a group working on a JSON schema for some time. They were supposed to have published their results as an IETF specification in late December, and they delayed that by a couple of months. So we're just about technologically at the point where there will be such a thing as a JSON schema that a developer who's writing a reading application can use to validate that an incoming JSON document is correctly formatted. So once that happens, then the tool vendors will start supporting JSON schema, and then I expect the Energistics communities to then begin deciding whether they want our ML standards to transition away from XML or maybe to have XML and JSON. I would say that in the new ETP, Energistics Transfer Protocol, it's full of JSON. So new things that we're doing, we're taking advantage of JSON where we can. In the new WhatsML standard, which is XML, but the way we represent log data, in the event that you create a file, an ASCII file of a log, used to be in old versions of WhatsML, the log data was in a comma delimited list, and now it's a JSON array that we expect you to bracket with a seed data block to protect it from XML parsers. So we're taking advantage of JSON as much as we can without completely upsetting the industry, but the industry, we expect once the JSON schema comes out, will push us to begin migrating to JSON from XML.
The next question from an attendee in France. What is the relation between Energistics and the Open Earth community, which is a community launched by Halliburton a couple of years ago?
Right, so Energistics as a standards body participates in any open forum which is attempting to be vendor neutral. So Energistics participates in the new Open Subsurface Data Universe. Energistics participates in the Open Earth community. We will participate in any of those open source kind of communities, but our message isn't to talk about vendors. Our message is to push standards and promote the adoption of Energistic standards, not only into and out of those environments, but specifically in the case of the Open Earth community, if you have microservices being created to build up an Earth modeling workflow, little tiny RescueML objects, it would make sense for those to be the way those microservices communicate with each other. So we do participate in those things, but we consider ourselves to have a limited mandate about promoting the use of our standards.
Actually, Mr. Blondel did contribute an answer to one of his previous questions. Equinor has published a DLIS.io library in GitHub. And I think there's also a SegWi.io from the same company. Vahid Serajian puts a question to us. Most of the service companies still use WITS. I would qualify maybe the word most, but there are indeed some of them. Is there a code developed to convert WITS to WITSML format so we use to be used on rig site or data center?
We don't host such a thing. We're aware that there are commercial solutions from some of our members that will convert WITS level 0 into WITSML. Most of the use of WITS level 0 that we encounter are inside a drilling rig, and it's used for rig components to communicate one to another. There are still some companies that try to use WITS level 0 to go from the rig site into the office, but that's not considered architecturally to be the way that people should be doing that. But at any rate, we don't have an open source utility of some kind that would convert WITS to WITSML live. But if you're interested, we do have some members that have commercial solutions that do that.
Any further questions? I'm now at the end of the current list on my screen.
I did answer one. I did answer one in writing that I'll just repeat for people who might not have noticed it. That someone asked whether Energistics is the owner of the DLIS standard, and the short answer is yes. The API gave API Recommended Practice 66, which is the DLIS standard, to maybe even to Energistics' predecessor company, POSC. But Energistics is the owner of the intellectual property for DLIS.
And you will find that that standard on our website under Industry Resources in our portfolio menu item. You will find downloadable or links to such all the standards that we are indeed responsible for and have IP ownership.
So I know we're at the end of our time, but we had a few comments and questions in the chat actually. So the first is, yes, we will be sharing the slides, more than likely posting them along with the video, the recording of this webinar. So we'll make sure that those are available on our website. Also, we had a clarification from one of our Schlumberger folks about Delphi. Apparently it's a hybrid cloud solution currently leveraging substantial capabilities from GCP and Azure. So I didn't want to, I know we said it was Google, of course, but apparently there's more, and also with some efforts on other cloud platforms such as AWS.
Right, that's true. Clinton's right about that. I wasn't trying to characterize Delphi as being only Google, but the Petrel workflow that we showed, at the SEG was Google.
Yeah. So we had one more question actually. Are the apps vendors who use ETP to share data between apps public?
So it's not a secret. So that's from Volker. It's not a secret. But we don't have kind of a place where we promote our members commercially. The one who makes the most noise commercially is Paradigm. So Paradigm has a commercial product that uses ETP to communicate between its Petrel plugin and the Paradigm world, if that's the EPOS database or the non-EPOS SKUA or whatever their products are. So they talk quite a bit commercially about using ETP to communicate among their stuff. I'm not aware of other companies that have made similar commercial announcements, but some of those companies are actively involved in the testing that we do at our RescueML special interest group meetings. But I don't want to talk about that so much because they haven't really made formal commercial announcements of availability.
Okay, and we have one last question. We'll let Neil be the last question that we answer, and that is any work extending to process control domain OPC UA or MQTT? So
yes, definitely, Neil. We have been working for some time. So I also have a role, in addition to CTO of Energistics, I'm on the technical advisory committee of the OPC Foundation, and we've been working for quite a while with a small group that have been creating an OPC information model, which is derived from WhatsML, so that there'll be a freely available OPC UA information model for companies that want to sell electrical equipment into the automated drilling world. And then after we're done with that, we'll move into ProdML and do that same thing for production wells. So we have quite a good relationship with the OPC Foundation. MQTT, so in that world, there are quite a few Internet of Things telecommunications protocols that people talk about and wonder why did we make Energistics Transfer Protocol? Why didn't we just use NiFi? Why didn't we just use the Object Management Group's DDS? Why didn't we just use MQTT? And the sort of the answer is that the community involved looked at all of those standards and found them all wanting for some reason or another. So the architecture for ETP was chosen to be WebSocket, and those other commonly heard of Internet of Things protocols just weren't adequate. But we're aware of it, and incidentally, among that little alphabet soup, the ones which are more likely to match up to ETP in the future would be MQTT or DDS. And then the OPC Foundation works with those other standards bodies to think about how you would implement even OPC over something other than plain TCP, to have OPC over MQTT or OPC UA, that is, over DDS. OPC Foundation website, there's a special document. A lot of people thought that there was a lot of overlap between DDS and OPC UA. So those two groups produced a formal document explaining the differences and when you would use one versus the other. So there's more of an overlap in some sense between UA and MQTT and DDS than there would be to ETP. So and Neil, we can talk about that in more detail if you want.
Okay. Well, thank you again, everyone, for having joined us for this session. We do really hope that it was informative. And again, if you have any further questions you would like to submit to us, info@energistics.com. We'll get to the
Energistics.org.
.org. Sorry. I forgot. Thank you very much. Jenna, you want a few closing words?
Just want to thank everyone for attending, and we hope to see you on our next webinar, which we are planning for the end of February. So watch for an announcement of that. I think it'll be very interesting. It's about digital transformation and Energistics. So stay tuned. Have a great day or evening, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks,
Bye.
everybody.